Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world. If you're joining us online or at any of our locations or in the prisons or here in the room, that's a lot of people to talk to all at once. It's so wonderful to be with you today, and it is so wonderful to be kicking off this series on the life and lessons that we can learn from Samuel. As Josh said, my name is Sarah. I'm a member of the team here at C3, and I am unapologetically obsessed with the Old Testament. So it's the best part of the Bible except for the Jesus bit, and I think that we should always head back there, because if you want to learn about the nature and character of God, you're going to find it interwoven through the beautiful story that is also really intense, crazy, creepy, and bloody sometimes, that is the Old Testament. This year we decided for our Old Testament series that we were going to focus on a character. Samuel has 2 books in the Old Testament, 1 and 2 Samuel, and that is a lot to try and cover in a preaching series. So instead we've gone with looking at the nature of who Samuel was. And the goal for this next few weeks is to really look at how we can learn from his life, his leadership, and his legacy, in terms of taking those lessons and then applying them into our relationship with God. Now, when I was trying to decide how to kick this series off, I realized that there was a really important piece of context that we have to have in order to understand the significance of Samuel as a character. Okay, because Samuel plays a really important role in the transitional life and history and politics and culture of the Israelites. And the book itself, in terms of chronology, so the order in which the Bible goes, Samuel sits at the end of the book of Judges. So last year, and you're welcome to head back into our sermon series online from last year and look at the book of Judges, but we discussed then this cycle that the Israelites were going through of obedience and rejection of their relationship with God. And what was so frustrating for God at the time was he had set them up to be his people, set apart from the rest of the world, in intimate relationship with him like no one else. And they were like, yeah, it's okay. All right, fine. But we don't get to have what the other people have, and that's annoying. I don't get to have a physical idol to worship because you said, God, we don't worship idols because that's putting glory on something above God, and we're not going to do that. So that annoyed the Israelites. They also wanted a king. They wanted an earthly ruler, and God was like, no, I'm your king. Worship me, and I will tell you how to live your life. And they were like, yeah. But if we could have one on earth, like everyone else, that would be great. So God sort of compromised, for as much as God compromises, and provided them with judges who were political leaders who would help them in specific times in the life of Israel to guide them, either politically or in a military position, towards their obedience and salvation. But it wasn't enough. And so, in fact, at the end of the book of Judges, we see that it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So we have loosely organized anarchy amongst the people of God. And it's important for us to know that, because that is what gives us so much insight into the significance of the role that Samuel then begins to play. Now, I have a Connect group, a C3 group, that meets every other Thursday, and they're great, and I love them. And so this week that we just had, I was like, we're going to look at the book of Samuel, because I needed to test some of my material out to make sure that we were going on the right track. And I have a lot of opinionated people in my group, and so that can be very helpful for those sorts of things. But what was so interesting about it was that I realized that in this introduction, I could go down 3 different routes, and I imposed all of that upon my group. And I thought I could go into this political thing that we've discussed, right? The fact that Samuel is kind of a bridge between the time of the judges and the time of the kings, because it's his responsibility to anoint the first king of Israel. He does that later on in the book. So we could look at that. That would help us really understand why it was important that he was being so obedient, that his character was so beyond repute and all that kind of thing, and that would be really cool. Or I could talk about the spiritual significance of his leadership. Because you see, up until this point, the high priest had been a role that had been passed down from generation to generation since the time when the Israelites were in the desert. So we had this guy called Aaron, who was Moses' brother, and it was his descendants who would become the high priest. So in the book of Samuel, in chapter 2, we have this guy called Eli. And Eli is the high priest at the time of Samuel's birth, life, etc. And he is doing a bad job, sadly. His sons have basically brought the priesthood and the temple into disrepair. They're corrupt, they're taking advantage of their leadership position, they're greedy, they're gluttonous, and they're basically ruining the holiness that has been expected of the priesthood from generation to generation. And previously, political leadership and spiritual leadership have been separate in the lives of Israel. But now, Samuel seems to be in his prophetness and in his leadership and in his judgment, blending that responsibility of spiritual and political leadership together. So we could talk about that. Finally, the route we could go down would be to look at Hannah. Hannah is Samuel's mum, and she's cool. We like her. We like all the women in the Bible, and they don't get nearly enough airtime, but that is not what I'm here to talk about today. Hannah is interesting because she is wife number 2 of a fairly inconsequential Israelite guy. And I say that because the main part of the story that he plays is to be the identifier of Hannah. Hannah was his wife. And not even his first wife, his second wife. But she was his favorite wife, which I guess is a good thing in that context. And we won't try and impose our own moralistic views on what was happening in the Old Testament, because then we end up in a mess. So we just don't do that, okay? So Hannah is wife number 2, but she's barren. She can't have children, and she is ridiculed and rebuked for this weakness. And obviously, the other wives are jealous because she's still the favorite despite this thing that she's not able to do. So she goes to the temple in Shiloh where Eli, the high priest, is, and she is bereft. Okay, she is a faithful woman. She gets on her knees before God, and she is like, please, give me a child. I will dedicate his life to you if you just provide me with the son that I so desperately want. Free me from this ridicule that is my life for something that I have no control over, but you, God, do. She is so intense in her intercession that Eli, the high priest, who in theory is close to God, assumes she's drunk, which speaks a lot to the culture of the temple. And also his inability to have discernment at that point in his faith. Because if he can walk past a woman who is putting her whole self before Jesus and go, it's probs alcohol, not great indication of where he's at in terms of his relationship with God as well. But thankfully, he does realize that she's praying, and then he's really impressed. And he's like, God will bless you and you will have a son. And she does. And his name is Samuel. And she dedicates him, like we've had dedications here in Cambridge today, to God. The difference is that when she dedicated him to God, he went and lived at the temple. And we don't expect the people who dedicated their children to leave them with us. It's like if you took them to kids' church and then left them there. Hard pass. Please pick them up at the end. So, Hannah's cool, right? We like Hannah. Hannah's great. Hannah's an example of faithfulness. Hannah's somebody that clearly has a lot of spiritual strength. But when we're reading the Old Testament, I think it's very important that we put on what I like to call our Old Testament goggles. Because we need to have a very intentional lens when we read the Old Testament. And I always like to ask the question, where have I seen this before? Because what you're going to find as you read the Old Testament is there are certain narrative traits that come up again and again and again. And this is an intentional storytelling technique. Because when we read the same principles of a story again and again and again, we start to be able to adopt the lessons that we've learnt before into a new story without needing all of the detail. So if we think about Hannah, barren, favorite wife, has a son who is not the firstborn, but that child still has significance in the kingdom of God, and specifically with the people of Israel, we ask ourselves, where have I seen this before? And the answer is Genesis. We see it 3 times, at least. We see Sarah, the wife of Abraham. She is barren, but she has a son called Isaac, who becomes one of the patriarchs of the Israelites. Isaac marries Rebekah, who's also barren. Rebekah has 2 sons, twins, called Esau and Jacob. Jacob is the secondborn. Isaac was the secondborn of Abraham. Sarah's firstborn, but there was Ishmael. It's a different story. And he becomes significant in the people of God. And then Jacob marries Rachel, his second wife, who's barren, who has a son called Joseph, who becomes a significant political leader and enhances the movement of the people of God. In fact, Rachel and Hannah specifically have the most in common, because they are the second wife and the favorite, and their son is not really the one that should have influence, but really does. So, if we wear our Old Testament goggles, which I'm expecting you to now, thank you. I assume there's participation across the world with that moment. And we, across the whole world, everyone's wearing their Old Testament goggles right now. As we contemplate these similarities, we are in chapter 1 and 2 of 1 Samuel, and we already know that this guy is going to make moves. Because if we're using the same narrative techniques from the significant patriarchs in Genesis, then when the people of God read the story of Samuel, they know something big is coming. And because of hindsight, so do we. So as I said, I was trying to figure out which one of these 3 routes to go down, and as you can tell, I decided to go on all 3. And there is so much more that you can explore, and I really would encourage you to in your groups as you go about this study in Samuel, whether you're fascinated by the political moves, curious about the spiritual change, whether you want to be a part of acknowledging the unacknowledged but incredibly significant women in the Bible, no pressure, pick that one. Whichever one you decide to go down, you are going to see the nature of God at work as he is consistently seeking relationship with his people. And he is consistently seeking his relationship with you. And that is what is so incredible, is the same God that was at work here is the God that is at work in your life. And all you have to do is listen. So, Samuel, the main guy, the one that we're here to talk about today. I have the privilege of going into 1 Samuel chapter 3, where we are going to look at an introduction to who Samuel is. You're welcome to join me in the text. I'm using the NIV for this discussion. And what we're going to look at specifically is the first time that Samuel and God have a personal interaction. So it says, the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions, which does sound kind of like how it is now. But that was important then because remember, we're at the time of the judges. So clearly, Israel and God are not on great speaking terms at the moment. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. And the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel answered, "Here I am." And then he ran to Eli and he said, "Here I am, you called me." And Eli, in the middle of the night, was like, "No." He said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." And so Samuel went and lay down. Again, the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and he said, "Here I am, you called me." And he said, "My son, I did not call you. Go and lie down," which is what I assume an adult would do at 2 a.m. when you wake them up for the second time in the row. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time, the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and he went to Eli and he was like, "Here I am. You called me." And then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. And so Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went back to his place to lie down. And the Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." So, what can we unpack about this interesting interaction between these three significant characters? Eli the high priest, Samuel the child, and God, the God of Israel. Well, the first thing that we can do is realize that it is important for us to listen to the voices around us. Samuel hears a voice of authority, one that he's not familiar with in terms of identity, but he makes an assumption that it must be Eli, because who else would be calling him? And so he goes with every intention of being obedient. And Eli, in his spiritual maturity, which does appear to be fading based on how many times this took, is able to provide wisdom to Samuel with regard to what to do next. Eli's not perfect. In fact, the entire narrative of those first three chapters is basically telling us that he is in decline when it comes to his connection with God. But that doesn't take away from the significance that he plays in the life of Samuel. And so my question to you is, who are the voices in your world that you can listen to, who could guide you and help you on your journey of faith? Because similarly to this time, we do not frequently hear the physical voice of God. And so we must be seeking it out, trying to figure out what it means for us to listen to God. About 10 and a half years ago, when I was humming and hawing about the decision to immigrate from South Africa to here, I came across the job ad for a youth pastor role in C3 Church in Cambridge. And I went to my family friend Margaret's house. I'd grown up 2 doors down from Margie, spent lots of time at her house. She was my godmother for all intents and purposes. And I said to her, "Oh, there's a job. Youth pastor at this church in Cambridge. I'm thinking about applying for it. There's only 2 days left for the application. Don't know if it's the vibe that I'm going for." And she said, "Sarah Elizabeth Hewitson." And you know when you get full named by an adult that it's serious. She said, "Sarah Elizabeth Hewitson, if you do not apply for this job, you are disobeying the voice of God." I was like, that's very intense, but she was South African, so it's a balance. You know. So the Africans in the room are like, we know what that means. It was such an interesting moment for me because it wasn't like I'd had the booming voice of God being like, "Apply for the job." But I'd had a stirring in my spirit and a confirmation from a friend. And her willingness to speak into my life and my willingness to be obedient to God led to an incredible decision that became a big part of my story. And I recognize that choosing to move across the world might not be the most relatable tale. That being said, this is a very transient city, so it actually might be. But we don't always know that the big moments are the big moments in the moment. Samuel didn't know that it was a big moment. Samuel heard an authoritative voice and he responded. And maybe God is not asking you to make a big move. He's just asking you to make a move. And so I question again, whose voices in your world can you, with discernment, pay attention to? The second thing that we can learn from this text is the importance of positioning yourself intentionally. I think it's so fascinating that we are told that where Eli lies is his usual place. And then separate to that, we have Samuel, who has lain as close to the ark of God, which is where the Spirit of the Lord dwells for the Israelites at the time. He's as close as he can possibly be. But he's far enough away from Eli that when he goes to Eli, Eli has not heard the call. And we assume God was loud. And he must have been for Samuel to assume that it was Eli calling for him, right? But also that this is Eli's regular place. So the high priest is not situating himself by God. He has situated himself where he is comfortable, and as a result, he is out of hearing. Samuel has positioned himself to hear from the Lord before he has even encountered him. But his expectation is that if I'm here, I am useful. What does it mean to position yourself intentionally to hear from God? This could be your personal spiritual practices, right? This could be reading the Bible, praying, spending time in church, serving, fasting, intercession, all the other mechanics that make up our faith. But you could be as physiologically present as you want to be, but if your heart and your spirit are not equally positioned into the direction of hearing from God, you could miss the mark too. I had the privilege of going on a silent retreat at the start of this year. Now, this is going to be preaching material for me for a long time for two reasons. One is, it was genuinely one of the most significant spiritual experiences that I've had. And the second is that I really enjoy the look on the faces of people who even just know me a little when I say I chose to be quiet for 48 hours, because that's hard for Sarah. But it was really interesting because I did make this choice. I'm like, here I am. I'm going to be quiet to hear from the Lord. And I actually didn't struggle with the external speaking bit, weirdly enough. That wasn't the problem. It was my internal narrative that would not be quiet, okay? And now, again, there's a certain amount of I don't know, it's a very weird experience to intentionally reduce a part of yourself. And I found myself being like, okay, today's the day. I will be quiet, go. And then my brain was like, what is quiet? And then I'm like, no, we're thinking about nothing. And I'm like, what's interesting about thinking about nothing is that you do concentrate quite a lot on thinking about nothing. And then you think about the word nothing and how when you're actually thinking about nothing, you're thinking about something. And that something is getting in the way of the nothing. And then also, why is it warm in the middle of February? And it was, and I had this Inside Out. Have you watched Inside Out? I had the picture of that in my brain of the different people. And there was a new one called Spiritual Discipline and Awareness. And she was like, shut up. I am trying to listen. With duct tape in her hand just in case Joy was like, I don't know, let's have fun. She was, it took a lot. But we got there. But genuinely, the practice of consistently choosing to turn myself spiritually as well as physically towards God allowed him to speak into my life in a way that I've never had before. And I love Jesus, and I have spent my life with him, and it was a pivotal moment. I'm 33 years old. I gave my life to Jesus when I was 7. I have not heard God like I heard God in that moment. It was not a booming voice. It was a peace and a stillness and a quiet voice that reminded me of who I was in Jesus because I was in relationship with him. So, where are you positioning yourself? And how are you positioning yourself intentionally to be in relationship with God? And finally, the lesson that we can learn from Samuel in this moment is that obedience is gradual. You see, when we think about who Samuel became, the prophet, the judge, the anointer of kings, multiple, because humans are sometimes the worst, and he had to do it twice. That's a lot to put on a kid, right? We're like, speak, Lord, the servant is listening. And then God's like, cool, for the next 25 years, I'm going to need you to make massive political change within your nation. When I was a kid, the story of Samuel was used in kids' church a lot because it's one of the few times we see a child as a main character in relationship with God. It's a great example of the fact that God uses people at all ages and stages of their life. But yes, as an adult, if I was like, do you know what, that might be a lot of pressure for a kid, and God agreed. If we end the story where Samuel says, speak, Lord, your servant is listening, we don't get the incredible lesson that is learned by the next few verses. It says in 1 Samuel 3, verse 11, the Lord said to Samuel, see, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. I'm not pretending it's not a heavy word, it is. But the instruction that was given to Samuel in this moment was not to become a prophet that would make a big change. It was to pass on a message. And it wasn't even the first time Eli was hearing the message, it was a confirmation. And so the next morning when Eli says to Samuel, "What did the Lord tell you? Be honest with me." He tells him. And that's it. That's the obedience. Me sitting in the kitchen at the table in Margie's house when she says to me, "Apply for that job." It is the word of the Lord. She did not then regale what the next 10 years of my life would be like once I moved to Cambridge. Apply for the job. Say you're sorry. Go for the walk. Have the meeting with your boss. Go on the adventure. Say yes to the trip. Have the coffee with the friend. Just take one step. Obedience with the small things is what builds trust. Samuel was obedient in this moment as a child, and then he was obedient again and again and again, and all the small steps lead to the legacy. All the small steps of obedience that you take lead to the depth of the relationship with God, lead to God being a part of your everyday life. He's not always asking you to make a giant leap. Sometimes it's just one small thing. And we can manage one small thing. So, we're going to spend the next 5 weeks looking at the book of Samuel, at his character, at his legacy, at some of the big moves that he makes. And as we do that, I want you to keep your Old Testament goggles on. And to remember that it all started with a small move by a child who positioned himself and listened to the voices around him so that he could hear the voice of God for himself. I'd love you to stand with me wherever you are. We're going to take a moment to pray before we go back into a time of worship. And I feel prompted to ask you, as we close our eyes to pray in response to this message, to be curious with God about the thing he's asking you to do. If there is a small step to take, maybe today is the day to dedicate your time to do it. If there's a person that you need to listen to because maybe you're not clear on what's God and what's not, ask them. Allow people into your world to speak. And above all else, position yourself. Whether it's by communion as we recognize the significance of the cross of Jesus, whether it's a moment of silence and prayer in the morning before you go about your day, whether it's something bigger like a fast that we're going to do later in the year, position yourself for God to speak in a way that he never has before. You are his servant. That is the commitment that we've made. We will serve God with our whole lives. We will dedicate our lives to him. It starts with the small steps. So Father God, I pray that you will give us guidance and inspiration. I pray that if we are looking for the next small step, that you will make it clear. Inspire us to position ourselves, bring people into our world who can speak, and help us find your authority in the words we're hearing. But Lord God, I thank you that you love us so much, that you would speak to us by name, that you care about our story and our narrative and our journey. In your precious name we pray. Amen.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you.